Hi everyone, my name is Enzo. I run TherapyRoute. In about 2009, Mark Solms started a group of which a bunch of us, I don't remember how many, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists came together to meet once a month for about 7 years. And what we did was somebody would present a case over a number of sessions, and we would use that case to try and, firstly, how we might understand that case in neuroaffective terms, and then how we could formulate the same case in psychoanalytic terms, and then ask as a group how the one way of thinking might inform the other. And that was called the Instinct Group. And Prof. Solms led it, and Adrian Perkel, who's joining us tonight to launch his new book, was a prominent member as well. And I'd like to think that group has something to do with the work that he's going to be presenting today. I don't think Mark Solms needs much of an introduction. He is a highly accomplished man. He's a psychoanalyst, a neuropsychologist. I believe he even got Psychiatrist of the Year. He's got hundreds of papers and many publications to his name. And he's asked me not to take too much time to introduce him. So he's going to kick us off tonight and then cross over to Adrian. Mark, are you there?
Yes, here I am. Thanks, Enzo. Thanks, everyone. Glad to see you all. Some of what Enzo said covers what I wanted to say, so it's just as well he was indistinct in parts, so that if you couldn't hear some of what Enzo said, you're going to hear it again at a higher volume. I'm here formally, I'm here as the editor of the book series, the Routledge Neuropsychoanalysis series, in which Adrian's book is one of the first volumes. It only began recently. So formally, that's why I'm here. Personally, I'm delighted to be here because of some of the things that Enzo was mumbling to you about. I have a sort of a backstory with Adrian, and the backstory with the whole area of inquiry that he's contributing to. That backstory, I think, in terms of its prehistory, we can take it back to Freud, and we can take it back to Freud, very young Freud, who published a book in 1891 on aphasia, which is a disorder of, God, my computer's asking me which language I'm speaking. So I'll just tell it it's English. The book on aphasia, funnily enough, which was about brain mechanisms of language, which is why my computer probably wanted to know what language I'm speaking. In that book, Freud, a neurologist, said we can't understand the brain mechanisms of language physiologically. We need to understand language is a psychological thing, and we need to study its psychological structure. But it is also, something that is disordered by brain lesions. And so somehow it's also bound up with the physiology and anatomy of the brain. And the way that he reconciled those two facts, that language is a psychological thing, but somehow it's produced by the brain, was to come up with this idea of what he called a language apparatus. He said there's a functional entity which we can infer, the sort of how language is organized, both physiologically and psychologically. That was the idea that he came up with, which then became the basis for his whole approach to the mind-body relationship. That language apparatus became what he later called, in a broadened form, the mental apparatus, in other words, the whole of the mind, not just language, and it became what he called metapsychology. In other words, what lies behind the surface of the mind. We observe conscious states, and then we have to infer what kind of organization or system or structure or functional entity explains what we observe. And the trick is that the same applies to the brain. That you observe the brain, it's just a thing, and then you want to know, but how does it work? And you've got to get beyond the physiology and the anatomy down to the underlying functional organizing principles. So this was Freud's idea. It's metapsychology is in fact what links psychology and neuroscience. It is the common ground of the two disciplines, and it's this that ties us at the hip, psychoanalysis and neuroscience. So Freud tried beyond that first book on aphasia. He then tried 4 years later, via his experience clinically with what those days was called hysteria, which nowadays we call functional neurological disorder. And please note, again, function. It's something is wrong with the functioning, not with the anatomy and physiology. Via Freud's deep acquaintanceship with what was then called hysteria, mental things somehow turn into bodily things. He then wrote his project for scientific psychology. I think that really is the beginning of neuropsychoanalysis, of an attempt to link clinical psychoanalytical observations with what we know about the anatomy and physiology of the brain, not to reduce it to the anatomy and physiology of the brain, but rather to have two observational perspectives upon this one underlying thing, which Freud called the mental apparatus, this metapsychological thing, this thing that you can't see, that you have to infer, the underlying lawful principles that govern the behavior of both brain and mind. And Freud abandoned that project because he had to, not because he wanted to, it's because he realized to his great distress that we don't know enough about the neurological side of it. It was impossible to study the living brain in terms of what are the dynamics, what's going on when the mind is in this sort of state, what's going on in the brain. That wasn't possible. The only method we had for studying the brain those days was at autopsy, after you're dead. So Freud had to abandon this effort because there were not neurological or neuroscientific methods available to be able to empirically observe the physical side. We could only empirically observe the psychological side. And so, as a good scientist who wanted to work with testable hypotheses and evidence rather than wild speculations, Freud developed psychoanalysis on its own terms, always saying, one day we will have to rejoin these two perspectives, but that'll only be when there are advances on the physical side. There were people who potted away over the intervening years during the 20th century, but really things only began to hot up again almost 100 years after Freud's project. In the 1980s, there started to be a bit of momentum gathering among a small number of people who thought, well, let's try again. Now we have got the neurological methods to be able to link these two perspectives. And as I said, it's what Freud always wanted. It's what he always not only expected, but hoped for. And by the way, I speak with authority about what Freud wanted because I've translated the guy. I know his work better than I think anybody probably alive today because I've translated. I've had to take each sentence and think, what is he trying to say here? So when I say this is what Freud wanted, believe me, this is not me making it up. So we're in this, from the 1980s, we got into this wonderful golden age where we can now link these two fields with each other. And there were a group of people who started meeting in New York. That we then started an international neuropsychoanalysis society. Well, actually, first we started a journal called Neuropsychoanalysis. That was 1999. In the year 2000, we formed a society, had our first international congress. We've had one every year ever since. And it's now a very big movement, a large membership in the society. And the Routledge book series that Adrian's book is part of is the latest development organizationally or institutionally in the development of this field. But a turning point was 2013, and this is the period that Enzo was talking about. What we were doing in neuropsychoanalysis until roughly 2013 was all just science. It was just research, and those few psychoanalysts who even knew what we were doing were thought, well, that's all very well and good, but it doesn't make any difference to us. So you're learning things about how psychoanalytical concepts relate to neuroscientific concepts, but we're clinicians, and so I'm glad somebody's doing that, or not everyone was glad, but nobody was particularly excited about it except for us few geeks who were for whom this was it. The vast majority of psychoanalysts and psychotherapists weren't particularly interested. Until 2013, there was a turning point. That's when we started to apply. We'd made enough of an advance in our understanding of how these two fields link with each other on a theoretical and empirical research basis, to be able to start applying what we had learned to the clinical situation. And the turning point was, why I say 2013, that was when a paper, which I'm immodest enough to say I wrote it. It was called The Conscious Id. And it was a revision of our drive theory. And then I started this group that Enzo told you about, where a group of us in Cape Town met regularly, looking at clinical cases, psychoanalytical psychotherapy and psychoanalytical, various frequencies of treatment. But they were psychoanalytical cases, and we started to think, how would we understand this case differently if we applied a modern neurobiological drive theory to it rather than the classical Freudian one? And that's where I got to know Adrian as a very energetic and brilliant contributor to that group, which is not to say that Enzo wasn't the same. But tonight we are celebrating Adrian. Now, it's not a small matter that it was drive theory that became the thing that made this all clinically relevant. First of all, and I need to emphasize, this was particularly the aspect of psychoanalytic theory or metapsychology that Freud said, we're going to change all of this on the basis of biological discoveries of the future. Freud actually said in his 1915 paper, Drives and Their Vicissitudes, in that paper he said, I do not believe we can derive basic concepts about the drives from psychological observations. We have to borrow observations from biology and apply them to our psychological observations. Problem was, biology didn't have anything to say those days. And then in 1920, when he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, his other great paper on the drives, Freud said the same thing and said, that the biology of the future is going to blow away all of our speculations about drives. So it is precisely in relation to drive theory that the big breakthrough came. And most psychoanalysts don't even care about drives anymore. They thought it's all old fuddy-duddy Freudian nonsense. But you can't understand the relationship between the body and the mind if you don't have a drive theory. As Freud said, drive is the concept by which we conceptualize the link between body and mind. It is the body making demands upon the mind to perform work. And not unimportantly, these demands are felt as affects, and our field is all about affect, feeling, emotion. So this, despite its apparently abstruse sort of theoretical nature, it has immediate direct clinical relevance. And it was not a matter of people had lost confidence in Freudian drive theory, but we need a drive theory. If we don't have confidence in Freudian drive theory, we need a new drive theory. And that's what that group in Cape Town, we pioneered that. We were the first group to start applying a modern neuroscientific understanding of the drives to our clinical work to see, does it enable us to see things that we otherwise wouldn't see, which in turn would make us do things that we otherwise wouldn't do. It was a fantastic group. And Jaak Panksepp, the great pioneer of modern neuroscientific drive theory, was fascinated by what we were doing. He was thrilled that there were psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic therapists applying his ideas to our perspective upon the mind, which neuroscientists don't have. Remember, the mental apparatus, as Freud called it, can be observed from two different perspectives: as a thing, an anatomical organ, and as a subject, a being of the mind. And neuroscience doesn't study the mind that way. We do. We prioritize subjective being of the mind, and what can we learn about how it works from that perspective. And so Panksepp was delighted by what we were doing. Sadly, he died a few years into that early work on trying to apply what we've learned in the neurosciences to our clinical work via drive theory. He died in 2017. Adrian's book is about that. It's about exactly this question, and it's fundamental. It's about the driving forces of the mind, the fundamental motivating the things that drive you and me, that give rise to our feelings, which is what everything else is arranged around. I said we've been at it since 2013. That's 12 years, but 12 years, in terms of this, what we can learn by. Remember, it's an integration. It's not a reduction of psychoanalysis to neuroscience. It's saying, okay, well, let's see what do we see subjectively that we wouldn't if we use these concepts, and then what can we in turn contribute to the neuroscientific understanding? Because my God, there's a great deal to be learnt about the mind from the subjective point of view that they don't have. So what I'm saying is that even though it's been 12 years, it's still very much a work in progress. We're finding our way, and so there are many questions which are not yet resolved. And it's into that vortex that Adrian has cast this book. He's come up with some new ideas, disagreeing with me, I have to say, about how are we to think about Freud's profound concept of a death drive. How are we to think about this in light of modern neuroscience? So it's a great pleasure for me to hand over to Adrian, a fellow South African, a member of that pioneering group from Cape Town, and making, I think, intellectually a fantastic contribution to this exciting, frankly, I personally think the most exciting thing in psychoanalysis today. Neuropsychoanalysis. I'm proud of him, and I'm delighted that his book's in my series. And with those words, I hand you back to Enzo. Thanks, everyone. Congratulations, Adrian. Lekker.
Well, this time I'm going to try and not mumble now that I know this microphone's bit. Can you hear me now? Give me a thumbs up, down, somewhere. No, kind of. Okay, sort of. Sorry, can't do better. I'm pretty much yelling. So Adrian Perkel is a clinical psychologist and is a former lecturer at in psychology at the University of the Western Cape. He's been immersed in psychoanalytic theory, writing, and clinical practice, specializing in individual, adult, and couple psychotherapy for 35 years. He has been involved in numerous psychoanalytical and neuroscience and editorial organizations, both in South Africa and abroad, including the South African Psychoanalytic Confederation and the South African Psychoanalytic Initiative, SAPI, the Psychotherapy College, and is a founding member of the Association of Couple Psychoanalytic Psychotherapists. He's also on the editorial board of the professional journal Psychoanalytic Practice, and is a member of the International Advisory Board of the Couple and Family Psychoanalysis Journals. He's also focused his research over the past years on the aggressive drive in symptom formation and couple conflict, and his most recent publication is the book Unlocking the Nature of Human Aggression, a Psychoanalytic Neuroscientific Approach. We heard that from him not so long ago, actually. Well done, Adrian. Which is published by Routledge. Adrian, are you unmuted?
Can you hear me?
Fantastic. We can.
How's that?
Welcome.
I am going to just ask you to allow me to share my screen. Just in case I run out of time, the most important things I actually want to start off saying is this huge thank yous to a few people. First and foremost, of course, to Mark, not only for your kind words and your participation tonight, but really for your contribution to the field. As Enzo just alluded to, the immense contribution. And that's well known. But I also want to, just on a personal note, thank you for, even when you mentioned disagreements, you're always so open to other concepts, to thinking about things, and so you've had a really generous hand in just my own development. And these books wouldn't have been written without your input. So, really appreciate your support. And Enzo, your participation too has been fantastic. And without the group that you initiated with Mark, these books may never have got written. And just one or two other quick thank yous, obviously, to Routledge for taking on the project, and the commissioning editors, Zoe Mayer, the production manager, Daniela Amadeo, to Jenny and Michaela for their contribution to the work, and to thank you all for participating tonight. So what I want to do is really just extract a couple of ideas from the book, because obviously I deal at length with the great many ideas and in much more depth. So just in the half an hour that we have together, I want to really just give people a taste of some of the concepts that underpin the way I formulate not only the book theoretically, but also the implications, which I hope to get to at the end, of what this means for clinical practice. And at the end of the day, that's such an important part of what we theorize about. So just a little bit of background. The death drive remains, I think, as Mark alluded to, it's one of the most contentious concepts in psychoanalysis, and has remained that for the past 100 years. And it continues to cause, as Valdre put it, Rosetta Valdre, caused such a stir, continues to. And yet, the death drive represents quite a watershed concept, because it's so central, and I hope to show this through the lens of, in fact, modern neuroscience, how that, in a way, it shows us how the death drive, in its very prescient observations that Freud made, dovetails with a lot of the concepts that are emerging in the modern era. And so some people see it as a outmoded concept, or as a philosophical, meta-psychological concept. I hope to show that actually these days we can square it in the realm of science. And I'm going to make those links as we go along. But more than seeing it as a watershed concept, in my view, it remains central to the genesis of mind, and to all the symptoms and psychopathologies we deal with in the consultation room, in the mental space. And so it gives us an opportunity for a unifying theory, the basis for a unifying theory, not only around the mind-body connection, and in fact, between neuroscience and more traditional psychoanalysis, but a unifying theory of the etiology and the genesis of symptoms, which is obviously a key interest of the book. I want to just sort of half tongue-in-cheek talk a little bit about the stickiness of paradigms. And in some ways, Mark alluded to this, and I mean it in two ways. The one being that Freud was a neurologist who was adamant throughout his career that future science, future biology would refute or verify, modify many of his hypotheses and observations. But we often forget that fact and sort of have an inbuilt resistance to the idea of seeing psychoanalysis and the mind through the lens of neuroscience. But a second sort of paradigm point I want to make around this velcro effect of paradigms is Freud himself, despite this seminal breakthrough, in my view, which I'll talk more about in his 1920 work, this watershed work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he introduces and formalizes the concept of the death drive, and pointed out that he leaned into this concept more and more, the dual drive theory, in many ways still remained wedded to the ascendance or the primacy of the libidinal drive. Now, we can understand why he did that, because, all evolutionary theory, all biology would agree that the drive of life, which later in adulthood, and what we talk not in adulthood, in human development, obviously translates into reproduction and sexuality, but it's a very powerful and essential evolutionary imperative. And so it's not surprising that Freud puts so much store in the libidinal, not just sex or libidinal as in libido in a medical sense, but of a life drive concept. And in his 1920 work, he maintained that, in fact, there'd always been a duality in the way he thought about the mind, i.e. that the drives obviously engaged with life drive elements, but that a branch of that turned back against the ego in order to preserve the self, invest in the self. But in his 1920, and I put inverted commas because in a letter to a colleague of his, Grodek, he described the 1920 work as this little work that he had put together. But in this little work, which I regard as one of the most significant works of the last century, he consolidated and elaborated two interrelated drives. And these drives, in a sense, occupied a specialized function in the mental apparatus. And so he said that today, meaning then, the view of psychoanalysis, and his view was that the mind, if you like, benefited from a more dualistic approach. And by the way, when I say between the ego, between the sexual instincts and the life and the death instincts, I correct that in a minute through Mark's retranslation, that really we're talking about drives rather than instincts. And it's a fine but very significant point. And so the 1920 work introduces the duality of a life drive and a death drive, as opposed to the distinction between the ego and the sexual instincts. There is, I'm sure, a great deal of awareness of drive theory and what a drive means, but I want to just briefly revisit this for those who may not be familiar with it or who have sidelined it. So the question of what is a drive, and I put there too because one of I think the things that really helped sharpen my thinking about these subtle distinctions was Mark's retranslation. And it's one of the greatest works of the last 100 years, the retranslation of Freud's works and correcting some of the errors. And I've always grown up on the idea of the instincts, but it really makes it conceptual. It helps refine conceptually when we translate more accurately the German word Trieb for drive. So what is a drive? Mark also mentioned this briefly. For Freud, essentially the drive or drive theory rests on a psychical representative that originates from within the organism, from within the body. It reaches the mind and makes a demand for work. And what does that mean? What does a demand for work mean? Well, it means that all life drive needs, so libidinal needs, are not just about sex, they're also about life drive needs. All of these have to be met in the external environment. We can't meet needs outside of the environment in some form or another, right from the outset. And so we need to represent those stimuli or those feelings that are emerging from within ourselves and be able to translate them into meaningful work in order to meet our needs. Solms, from a neuroscientific point of view, puts it in a slightly different way. He says a drive is a measure of the expected free energy in the mind, energy that must be deployed in effective work. Now, that's the most important part, just I want to extract from that quote, in that free energy, and I'll talk more about this as we go along, when free energy is increasing or rising, it's a representation that something's going in the wrong direction, away from homeostasis towards entropy. You can almost think of an ink blot diffusing in water. It stops being an ink blot. And so as self-organizing beings, we need to minimize free energy, or Freud used the term bind, affect free energy, in order to maintain homeostatic parameters. And that's got to be deployed in effective work. Now, effective is something that I add an emphasis to that quote from Mark, and I'll explain why. So to put that essential point differently, effective work. Now that mental work that we're doing, i.e. that the drive is representing the work that needs to be done to meet life drive needs, can only really keep prompting in one direction. Life drive needs, in other words, can only keep pushing or prompting along the path required to fulfill those needs, and they do need to be specific, meaning air hunger and stomach hunger are not the same need and can't be met in the same way. So that specificity becomes quite important. And so when we have a need, we keep pushing in the direction of finding a way to extort a remedy for that need. Freud uses the word extort, and I love that word, because I think it captures very well what happens when we need to persist in meeting a need. But when needs are failing, when we're unable to meet those needs, then there's very little those life drive forces can do to remediate frustration when that is not being accomplished, except to keep going in the same direction. Now, in adulthood, that usually works. It usually solves the problem. But in infancy, of course, it doesn't, because the infancy cannot extort remedies on its own, except through inducing a response from a caregiver, primarily the mom. And it can only do that through crying, not through mobility, not through going to the fridge, through trying to represent its needs in the external environment, but in a way that has to be decoded, translated, attuned to. And so very often the infant's dysregulation or dysregulated state can't be remedied, and not because of poor attunement or because of bad mothering, but because its own body sometimes suffers from medical issues or from colic or from dysregulation that doesn't allow it to get back to homeostasis easily and exceeds a threshold. And keeping in mind that in infancy is when most of the roots of the psychopathologies we deal with in life and in our consulting rooms, that's where a lot of symptoms, most symptoms psychologically are based in the maladies, let's just say for now, of infancy. And so the infant has very limited opportunity or mechanism to extort that remedy, to use Freud's term. And so it leaves no remedy on its own, except to reverse the direction of that increasing arousal or that increasing free energy, which of course is a bad thing for biological persistence. So, i.e. not reversing, but increasing free energy. So the infant can't move forward to meet the needs, so it has to psychically move backwards. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Now, this links to a very important concept that Freud used the term Versagung. I hope that's well translated. And it's apparently a little bit context specific about how the meaning of the words, one of those words, but it represents the failure or the denial or the refusal, if you like, of a life drive need or a libidinal need. So in essence, really, we could talk about it as frustration of a need. And it's interesting. Frustration is one of those things that when you stop and observe it in your consulting room or in life, it comes up probably once a minute. I say with little exaggeration. But the amount of times when I've observed the word frustration coming up in my consulting room in a session, it starts to make sense of why Freud actually in his work put quite a lot of emphasis on this idea of frustration, of life drive needs, and the import that this experience has in the mind. And I'm going to build on that to elaborate what I mean. By the way, Freud doesn't call it this. I call it a neurodynamic signal because it helps us understand a mechanism, this concept of frustration, or Versagung, helps us understand a mechanism that also bridges the drives, the life drive when it is failing, and the activation of the death drive to provide a remedy for that failure. So let me just elaborate on this quote, which I think captures quite well what Freud was saying. So Freud notes that frustration has a pathogenic effect because it dams up libido, and so submits the subject to a test as to how long the psychical tension can be tolerated. And just think back to Mark's quotes of increasing free energy and the the negative impact that has on biological persistence. But when that's happening, there are only two methods for dealing with it. The one possibility, of course, when there's persistent frustration, is by transforming that psychical tension, if you like, that free energy in neuroscientific terms, into an active energy. And as adults, we do that all the time. We continue to push to extort a remedy from our attachments, from the world, from what we find in the fridge, from meeting our needs. But the second, when that fails effectively, is to renounce that satisfaction and turn back. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, in order to manage that frustration or to find other means, which are not active means, but psychical means, to manage and bind that increasing arousal, or if you like, that free energy. Solms puts this in a slightly different way, but in my view, and I hope Mark nods, is essentially describing the same phenomenon, which is that the difference between the sensory states, he puts it in modern terms, that are predicted by the system's internal states to flow from its active states, and the sensory states that actually flow from them must be minimized. And that difference is called surprisal. Now, that's a very important concept, which again, in my view, dovetails with the death drive concept. And I'll say a little bit more about that, because when we have a need, I expect to open a tap and get water. There's no issue. I meet the need. But if I open the tap and there's no water, I'm immediately in a state of the unknown, the unpredicted. And that's very stressful. Anxiety, arousal goes up. And that's a kind of trite example, but in life in general, in all biological organisms, want to minimize the gap between what we expect to happen in life and how we meet those needs. And when that difference starts to widen, and so what we expect to happen and what's actually happening is widening that gap, free energy is going up, surprisingly is going up. And this is an unexpected state, which is bad for homeostatic parameters and moves us in the direction of entropy. So really in the most simplest distillation of what Solms has said here, is that really the gap between what we expect and what we get, you can think of as surprisal, and that obviously links to rising free energy or unbound energy. So to put some of these steps together, well, surprisal really we could then say is associated with a rise in variational free energy. And I'm sure you're all aware, but just for those who are not, Carl Friston made the points, and Carl Friston is the author of the free energy principle, and is one of the most cited neuroscientists of the last few decades. But I just also point out, Freud did talk about bound and unbound energy and free energy, but the free energy principle Carl Friston distilled, and he made the point that everything minimizes variational free energy because that's in the interest of evolutionary persistence. Now, I make the link of that to increasing surprise or increasing unknowns leads to what Freud called Versagung, let's call it frustration. And the important point about that is that a rising free energy is actually, in a sense, it's an abstract concept. The free energy principle is mathematical, it's theoretical, and unless it can be translated by the mind into something, or the brain into something usable, it really remains a theoretical idea. And the link I think here that's interesting to think about is that what the psyche or the mental apparatus does is it experiences a rising free energy through this experience, this felt experience of frustration. And so as much as life drive needs to be felt in their specificity, so too, if you like, a rising free energy or frustration has to be felt to be meaningful in order to initiate some sort of remedial response. And this links to what I'm calling this neurodynamic signal, which is the sensation of frustration. We're all familiar with it. We all experience it day in and day out. This feeling, it's a feeling that's hard to distill, but it's a very familiar idea and it's a very familiar experience. The sensation, I call it. And when frustration is rising, it's increasing. It mobilizes this death drive, which, by the way, of course, think of synonymously with aggression and the aggressive drive. And that aggressive drive or that death drive can then be activated to remedy frustration in one of two ways: forward or outward, or backwards or in. So what does that mean? Well, I'm not going to dwell on the outward-facing element of aggression because it's manifest. It's easy to see. We know what happens when there's road rage, or the temperature goes up in a domestic dispute, or with anybody else for that matter. So these things, or this aspect of the aggressive drive, is fairly obvious. It's apparent. It's felt. But what we're more interested in I'm more interested in understanding symptoms and psychopathology is the inward-facing dimension of the death drive of the aggressive drive. And I'm going to say much more about that now. Before I go into more detail, I just wanted to posit the idea, which I think is obvious to most people, is the difference between, again, symptoms, this concept is something we use all the time. What do we mean by it? In the mental space, the pathology we deal with in psychology, of course, has an enormous amount of subjectivity involved in how life is experienced. And it's elusive and complex thing, which is why there's no cookie-cutter approach to fixing the problems of the human mind. A sign, medically, of course, can be seen objectively, like a rash on the skin. But for the most part, subjective report, subjective experience is critical in understanding the genesis of a symptom and subjective experience. So even flushing of the facial skin, what does it mean? Is it blushing? Is it sexual arousal? Is it embarrassment? Is it overheating? What does it mean? And without the person relaying the meaning of it to them, we wouldn't really be able to make proper sense of it. And of course, that links to the talk and cure and why it's such an essential part of treating these things. So I said earlier I was interested in the inward-facing aspect of the death drive or regression, because it links to, again, a concept we use day in and day out. 35 years of seeing patients, I've talked about defenses, I've taught this idea, I've read about this idea. And it was only in the last few years, actually, again, under reading some of Solms's work, reading some neuroscientific work, that I started to interrogate, wait a minute, but what is this mechanism that we talk about all the time? What are defenses exactly? And it links to the critical area of memory and the automatizing function of memory, which we're all familiar with, the importance of automatizing life drive needs coming from the brain and the body, because we can't reinvent the wheel each time we have to meet the need. And in the interest of the mental economy and evolution in a resource competitive world, we automatize these things. But so too defenses, or the regression to encoded death drive encoded memory, which I'll elaborate on, these also become automatized. So what are defenses and what are they for? Well, defenses really are early mental mechanisms that work in conjunction with the body, or they emerge as representations of somatic experience in infancy, which again is where most symptoms originate from. And it gets mobilized by what I call this internal barometric sense. In other words, it's the sensor of frustration which can register and respond to the internal milieu, i.e. my needs being met, I'm not frustrated. I'm in homeostasis, my needs not being met for whatever that need is. I'm moving out of homeostasis, free energy is increasing, and there's a response required to bind that energy. But in infancy, I mentioned, there's not much you can do. So when free energy and unpredictability is increasing for the infant because tensions are rising outside of homeostasis, and again, sometimes for their own medical or bodily challenges, that these will become encoded in the implicit memory, which can't be consciously always recalled or remembered in the first few years. These mechanisms, these mental representations, become encoded in that implicit memory and automatized. So when we're under stress, even in adulthood, the regression or the reversion back to that flaw, psychic flaw in the mental apparatus, in which these thresholds were breached, and free energy had to be managed in a mental way because they weren't managed in the real world where needs have to be met. And so these mental mechanisms or these mental defenses kick in. These mental representations then form the basis for defenses that, in Freud's language, become fixated or automatized, to which we revert repeatedly. Now, this links, of course, to another very familiar concept of the repetition compulsion. Freud made a meal of this. We're all familiar with it. And I put this slightly poetically, that one can think of it as the psyche choosing familiar suffering, i.e. the mental ways it's found to bind rising free energy, over unfamiliar uncertainty, because familiarity is more predictable. It's less costly from an energetic point of view, and reduces unexpected states of surprises. So it's a little bit like jumping in the swimming pool before someone pushes you in, or breaking up with a partner before they break up with you. We, in a sense, take control through the repetition compulsion in a mental way of those elements in infancy that we couldn't control, and had to use then mental means that were available through these, if you like, representations of bodily experience that were available at the time. We revert back to that. And this, in its automatized fashion, keeps repeating on us. And it is, in short, as much as it causes us distress in life, it is a better deal at bottom line for evolutionary persistence than would be ongoing surprise or uncertainty, rising free energy, and the threat of entropy that comes with that. Just to formalize it a little bit, we could say that decreasing satisfaction of needs met, i.e. life drive needs, libidinal needs, all life drive needs, and Panksepp has identified specific circuits in the brain related to specific life drive needs. But that's when there is a decreasing satisfaction of those life drive, particularly in infancy, which correlates with an increasing free energy and the threats of entropy, frustration activates. And we sense frustration from the beginning of life. We feel it, and or we sensate it. And it acts as a signal that this trend is going in the wrong direction, and that we're unable to, or the infant is unable to, extort a remedy from the external environment. And so the death drive or the aggressive drive mobilizes to then regress to these previously encoded defenses that are automatized. And their task is to bind or decrease this trend. And it's in the interest of conservation. The inversion of that, of course, would be that the infant's mind would totally fragment. It wouldn't survive mentally without some mechanism in the mental space to bind that surprisal, that increasing free energy. And that becomes the best available compromise formation. And it allows the subject, and I stress subject because it's subjective, it allows the infant to then reduce, to bind that free energy, and to get back to some sort of perceived stasis or quiescence. To take this a little bit step further, I say a little emphatically that life drive needs, none of them, or libidinal needs, do not in themselves lead to symptoms. It's the death drive mobilization that leads to symptoms. Now, I need to point out that I'm giving a broad brushstroke here, but in the book, I actually go into much more detail and how these ideas would link to specific pathologies. It's not exhaustive, but for example, I do go into detail about addiction or about sexual dysfunction, depression, anxiety, personality disorders, in order to really clinically operationalize the way the mobilization of the aggressive drive lies at the heart, not only of the genesis of symptoms, but of their cure. And when I say governed by developmental timeline, is that the mental representations available to the infant will obviously vary. A 3-day-old infant has very primitive mental representations of what its body can do or not do. A 3-month-old baby has more developed mechanisms. And the defenses we're all familiar with, projection, introjection, and so on, which underlie a lot of pathology, these mechanisms come out of these mental representations of the body. And so when I say governed by a developmental timeline, it's really to say that the defenses that encode and become automatized will depend on where and when in the infant's development the free energy or the frustration has breached a critical threshold that it can manage subjectively. So in the form of an equation, we could say simply from the outset of life that the mobilization of that aggressive drive or that death drive is directly proportional to increasing frustration of need fulfillment. And again, particularly in infancy when extorting a remedy is so complicated and often impossible. To put it a little bit differently, and I'm aware of time, so I'm going to just rush through this because I want to get to the point about treatment. I've just got 1 or 2 slides to share with you, is that we could say that aggression or the mobilization of the death drive as this bridge between the drives is directly proportional to rising free energy and mediated by frustration, inversely proportional to meeting homeostatic needs, which are subjective. The mobilization of this drive and its constituent processes, and this is what's so important because it links to defenses and the regression to these defenses, is thus directly proportional to the subjective barometric experience of frustration. And this is at the heart of what we're dealing with day in and day out in our lives in our consulting room, is this regression back through the repetition compulsion to these old mechanisms that became stuck, fixated, or became automatized in memory that we no longer remember, and yet is there. Implicit memory, which we cannot access cognitively or the words, and yet play such a key role in the later developments of symptoms. I just want to give people a little bit of a hat stand to latch it on to my last point about treatment, is that I think of aggression in the mind or the mental apparatus in the way that we can think of the immune system to the body, meaning that it prefers, and Freud made this point, by the way, it prefers a latent or an unobtrusive state, meaning the immune system of the body does not go looking for the fight. It only gets mobilized in response to some pathogen threatening somatic or biological homeostasis. And if you like, this aggression or the death drive is like the immune system of the mind, which doesn't go looking for the fight unless it perceives some sort of activation that is threatening homeostasis. And in that case, becomes mobilized. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, it links to my last point, which is that it modifies the way we think about treatment. We're, in a sense, the most important thing about all of this theoretical stuff to be more than just noise or philosophical concepts, or to remain in the meta-theoretical or meta-psychological domain, is that it needs to have an impact in our consulting room. And I come specifically from a clinical base. That's the bulk of my career is clinical work. And so, in a sense, using these concepts in the consulting room has demonstrated to me very empirically. The dual drive theory, if we accept it, requires, in a sense, a dual drive technique. Why? Because life drive needs make themselves felt. If they didn't, we wouldn't be able to act on them. In other words, if we didn't feel feelings, they wouldn't be feelings. And feelings represent needs, and needs are driven by drives. And the life drive elements are easy to see, easy to experience. So we don't really have to look for them. We can be passive. We can wait. And that material surfaces. And that's the classic paradigm all of us across any field of psychoanalysis or psychology will tend to use. We wait for material to emerge. But the death drive and the aggressive drive does not emerge. Often does not emerge. It's unobtrusive. It's in the background. And I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples of this. When we have a depressed patient in our room, the last thing we see, let's say in a retarded depression, is aggression. We see someone in distress, in pain, heavy. It's no sign of aggression. But we also understand that depression is about introjection of the aggressive drive encoded in first year of life. And activated by loss and other mechanisms. But the point being that unless we actively ferret out the underlying aggression, the hate, the hostility, the depression will often remain untreated, or the treatment will be prolonged. So the point is that because of the unobtrusive nature of aggression and the death drive, it requires a more active approach. And I don't mean this in the same way that people like Ferenczi in the 1920s talked about active technique. I'm talking about being able to identify and map the aggressive drive in each person, underlying their specific symptoms, their specific psychopathology, and be able to actually name it and bring it out, ferret it out. And the effect that has is to really mobilize treatment in a much more effective way in the curing of those symptoms. And that applies across issues of sexual dysfunction, depression, anxiety, addiction, and so on. But the detail of all that I deal with in the book and the implication that that has for treatment. I'm aware we've come to time, so I'm going to just thank you all so much again for being part of this presentation and taking time out to share some ideas. There are many more, so I hope in time we'll be able to engage with them. And Enzo, I'll hand that back to you now.
That's thanks all for coming. I am going to put the video together and send it out, so you will be able to get another chance. Thank you all. Take care.